The $100 billion handshake. When Americans think of the space race, it may bring a couple things to their minds. Maybe some names like Alan Shepard, the first American to go into space, and John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. You may think of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, the crew of Apollo 11, the first manned mission to step foot on the moon. If you know a little more, then you may think of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions. You may also know about the Saturn V, the rocket that took men to the moon and is still one of the most powerful rockets to ever fly. You may also know the names of other astronauts and other things about the American space program. This is because most people who are watching this will only know one side, so you only have one perspective of the space race. Names in their stories like Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, or Alexei Leonov, seen here performing the first spacewalk, or Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, 15 years before the Americans had a woman in space. There's also the Soyuz rocket, one of the oldest and most reliable rockets ever made. Many of these names are all but foreign to most people, both back then and today. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR, was very secretive about many things. Just like all of its other military programs, the USSR never made its failures public. But some of our history gets covered up only because they are seen as lesser achievements. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdoms during World War II, fighting the Nazis on the Western Front, a slow, grueling battle, but with Hitler's quest for Lebensraum, or living space, it led the Nazis to develop more and more despicable weapons, one of these being the V-2 rocket. One of the head engineers was Wernher von Braun, a rocket engineer who fled to the United States as the war came to a close. Von Braun became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, the super booster that would propel Americans to the moon. We see this cycle of war leading to peace, and we see the same with the space race, except this war is not fought with blood and bullets, but with scientists, engineers, rocket fuel, and the brave men and women who dare test nature. From the crew of Soyuz 11, dying as their capsule depressurized on re-entry, to the crew of Apollo 1, who were burned alive on the launch pad. This war is not fought against each other, but against the laws of physics and the vicious environment of outer space.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And with those few words, John Fitzgerald Kennedy captivated the American public like never before and thrusted the Americans into the space race. The Apollo program was put into full speed. Astronauts began training for lunar missions, and the seriousness of getting boots on the moon became a reality. As well, in a speech to the UN on September 20th, 1963, JFK proposed a joint Soviet-American lunar landing.
The mission was unique, and it was supported because I think the populations on each side had a desire for the Cold War to be over.
Sadly, this proposal was cut short, as 2 months later, 3 gunshots rang throughout the streets of Dallas, Texas, and the plans of a joint lunar landing were scrapped. Richard Nixon did not support manned spaceflight as much as Kennedy, fearing that another accident like Apollo 13 was bound to happen, except this time, there would be casualties. Furthermore, the rapport that Kennedy and Khrushchev had built up over the years did not carry over well to Nixon and Khrushchev, and the idea of joint space missions would end up fading away with Kennedy.
At that time, the relations were not very good between our countries, but that project made us work together.
It was quite a symbolic effort to open the relationship between the two countries.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And just like JFK almost a decade before, those words captivated the American public, and it also seemed to have sparked something in the Soviet space program. Communications between the two space programs began to improve, and the talk of joint missions came back up. And with this, we see the birthplace of the Apollo-Soyuz test flight, the very first international space flight, and the $100 billion handshake that would build the International Space Station more than a decade later.
We should get together two superpowers in space, but it was kind of unique and that here each country had at least 10,000 nuclear weapons aimed at each other. But yet we would have a joint cooperation in space.
This was the peak of the Cold War. Both sides believe that the other side is the evil enemy.
We had a lot of fun because everybody made mistakes in the other language, and in some cases it's like learning listening to a 3-year-old trying to get better in English. So we made mistakes, and everybody got a lot of laughs out of that.
That's what made it easy for us to communicate with our U.S. counterparts, because we were professionals speaking the same professional language, and this helped us build a trust as well.
Well, we'd trained together for 2 years. In fact, it was our side that insisted we have to start 2 years in advance. And the Soviets then said, no, of course, everything was, they say, Bolshoi secret. Everything was a big secret. But it was really wonderful after we'd trained in the mock-ups, the simulators, back and forth for 2 years, to finally, you know, they launched from Kazakhstan. Back in the world, and then 7.5 hours later, when the orbit came across the Cape, we launched 2 days of phasing and catch-up maneuvers, and I went in to the final rendezvous and docking.
Less than 5 meters distance.
3 meters.
3 meters.
13 meters.
1 meter. Contact. Capture.
Ah! Just it.
Got it? Yeah, it'll stay open.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
Lexi. Just a moment. Okay, turn on the camera. Hit the remote. Okay. Here. Camera.
It was really the handshake which symbolized potential lessening of tension in the Cold War and friendship.
And with that, the $100 billion handshake had made history. The two spacecraft would stay docked for a little more than 2 days, and the two crews exchanged different foods, flags, and they did scientific experiments together. But the scientific portion was greatly overshadowed by the diplomatic portion. The lasting impacts of the Apollo-Soyuz test mission are tremendous. The Apollo-Soyuz mission paved the path for more international space flights, such as when the space shuttle visited the Russian space station, but more so, this handshake led to the creation of the single most expensive man-made object, the International Space Station. Without Apollo-Soyuz, the US and USSR would have most likely just kept their space stations separate. This test mission also led to a universal docking adapter that is now used at the International Space Station. It has led to over a 21-year-long presence of humanity in space. As well, it improved the relationship between the United States and the USSR. At a time where there was fierce tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, facing threats of all-out nuclear destruction, 2 cosmonauts and 3 astronauts docked spacecraft as representatives for their country, their people, and for the world, showing that cooperation in space is not just possible, but beneficial. It is where 2 rivals can participate in diplomacy, science, and the exploration of outer space. This was the beginning of a new era of friendship between the US and the Soviet Union. And in 1998, the main construction of the ISS was completed, marking the beginning of a new era of science, technology, and diplomacy.